Okay guys, welcome back to another episode of Rotten Reviews. Today I'm going to take a look at Star Trek The Motion Picture, 1979, and it has a tomato meter rating of 42% and an audience score of 42%. I would largely agree with this. In fact, I agree completely that it should be considered rotten, and for the primary reason that it is just boring. It is the most unforgivable thing that any story can be. Boredom is worse than controversy. Boredom is worse than bad political statements. Boredom is the story killer in all its forms. I'm going to jump right into the Rotten Reviews and see how many people in October of 2019 would agree with this. Right off the bat, we've got a 3.5-star review. Beautiful movie, profound and interesting story. Well, I'm not going to argue with that. It is beautiful. It is beautiful, certainly by 1979 standards. It is a clear attempt to portray just how big of a budget it has and how beautiful it can be, and that is a big part of the boredom, in which you are treated to long 5-minute plus stretches of simply beauty shots of the outside of the USS Enterprise. It is very long-winded and boring, and I saw this originally at a drive-in theater when I was somewhere between 8 and 9 years old. I recall as a kid being intensely fascinated by Star Trek. I was a big fan of the original show as it ran in syndication throughout my childhood. There wasn't a time in the 70s that I was without seeing episodes of Star Trek on television. Many people my age can attest to the same thing. Now, when I saw it in the theater, I remember that even being in a drive-in theater with popcorn and drink and a lot of people around and the excitement in the air, it was completely boring. I found myself almost unable to pay attention to it, and believe me, I was a big Star Trek fan. I knew everything about it. As a 9-year-old at the time, I could have told you every detail about everything in Star Trek. I would have been a 9-year-old Star Trek lore librarian, so to speak. So having a Star Trek motion picture be boring was just a travesty. Now, these reviews are from 2019, and they're certainly made by people who could not have been alive to have seen this in the theater. They should consider themselves lucky. I continue to be a Star Trek fan, but I am going to go through this and make the point that The Wrath of Khan was probably the best Star Trek movie, and everything since then was a little bit downhill from there. I certainly enjoy most of the other movies, but The Wrath of Khan would have been my peak. That's certainly an action-adventure movie. That's the movie that we, as young Star Trek fans, had anticipated from the first one. We didn't get it. Let's continue on. 1.5 stars. 2 hours of nothing. The admittedly sharp, visually appealing set design and lighting weren't enough to make up for the glacial pacing, boring dialogue, which is 90% of the film, awkward character interaction silences, characters staring into space, no pun intended, hilariously bad Windows XP-esque visual effects, and utterly uninteresting storyline. If I'm not a Trekkie, which I'm not, there's no way I'd be conceivably entertained by this slog regardless. I'll never revisit this. I would largely agree, particularly if this review was written by a millennial who hadn't been a fan back in the day. I wouldn't expect them to be able to sit through this. I would recommend that people of that age group simply skip this movie, pretend like it didn't exist, and just start out from The Wrath of Khan and move forward. One main point on this particular critique that I'll agree with is the uninteresting storyline, because even as a Star Trek fan from back in the day, I found this obviously a retread of an episode from the original series in which a robot called Nomad is being dealt with in the same way as V'ger in this movie. So this is not original, and in fact, it has been revealed in the years since this movie came out that the entire premise of the movie was originally designed to be a pilot episode of a new Star Trek series that never made it to air, and it shows. They stretched it out into 2 hours plus, and it is a complete snooze fest. 3.5 stars. Star Trek is a popular IP, and this film was one of the first forays for the popular show to cross over to the big screen. 1979 was a special year for science fiction films. Keep in mind, this is in the wake of Star Wars, when sci-fi was all the rage. Star Trek the Motion Picture arrived in the wake of Star Wars, and with Paramount's publicity department in high gear, the general public was expecting something as big, loud, and exciting as George Lucas's 1977 adventure. What they got instead was a slow-moving, well, yes, that's one big argument I see out there as to why this is considered the least popular Star Trek film, and that is because it had to try to follow in the wake of Star Wars. I don't really agree with this because as an original fan back in the day, as a 9-year-old seeing this film, I was also a huge Star Wars fan, and I did not expect Star Trek to be Star Wars in any regard. I knew I probably couldn't have articulated it in words like I could now, but I did not expect Star Trek, a first Star Trek movie, to mimic Star Wars in any way. I considered it a completely different genre, at least in my mind at the time. Again, a 9-year-old wouldn't be able to articulate this, but that was my feeling into this. So I don't buy that excuse that it's because George Lucas's Star Wars changed what we expected from a space adventure. Well, Star Trek wasn't supposed to be a space adventure. It was supposed to be more cerebral. It was supposed to be more what-ifs with technology, whereas Star Wars is more of a straight-up fantasy just set in space. So I completely disagree with that. I think this is because they let the original fans down. The original fans of the 67 to 69 show expected an exploration of something new. They expected some action, but they didn't expect Star Wars. They expected a tight direction. They expected not so much focus on the exterior of the ships, but they expected to see new things and be taken on a new adventure, to have more what-if questions posed to them. And you didn't get this from this. You got just a long, slow, drawn-out, almost a character study. And even as a character study, it quite fails because you had the original characters from the show brought back in this movie, and yet most of the characters aside from Kirk and his second in command had no standout dialogue. They had no interaction which really showed us anything. They simply came back together. There was a reunion scene. It was a little off-putting that Spock was kind of a stranger to them all. That was explained in the plot, but still it felt weird because I guess we had seen these characters, we had known these characters so well from the TV show that the movie doesn't really tell you, it doesn't specifically tell you how much time had passed between the original series and this show in the universe of Star Trek. So yes, we know that more than a decade had passed in the real world between the original series and this motion picture, but the movie didn't tell you exactly how long had passed in their world. We got the sense that maybe 1 or 2 years had passed, and yet they seemed like strangers, and a new character, this Deckard character, was brought in to simply be more or less tossed around and abused by William Shatner's Kirk. It was wasted. It was wasted footage to me. It was very boring. There was no actual clear-cut villain. There was a mystery in this V'ger component, but it wasn't shown as an actual villain. We expected some kind of antagonist villain in the plot, and we didn't get that. We just got a long, drawn-out mystery. So I say the character interactions were weak, and this didn't give you the feeling of the original show. It was like you were seeing people that resembled the original characters, but they were going through the emotions. They didn't have the same. It was almost like strangers masquerading in the bodies of the original characters, if you will. I'm trying to put that into words. Maybe I'm failing. 5 stars. It was a great movie, and I remember being engrossed during its initial airing. So many years later, especially with sequels and spin-offs and reboots in mind, my family and I were all shocked to discover that the movie, though there was tension, there was no action, no fighting. I don't think a shot was fired, if I recall correctly. The movie consisted of long periods of dialogue interspersed with meaningful, expressive glance shots between characters. The trip Shatner and Scotty took by shuttle. I see where they're going here in that final sentence. They're talking about the initial about 10 minutes opening shot of Shatner and Scotty traveling to the Enterprise from Earth by shuttle because in the plot the transporters weren't working correctly. And that was the excuse the filmmakers used to have us show basically an endless beauty shot sequence around the Enterprise that went on forever. Now, this wasn't that off-putting to us in the original airing of this film, or the original showing of this film, because we just craved this stuff so much. But after we figured out that nothing else was going to happen after that action-wise, it became tedious. So you have long periods of dialogue where, well, I wouldn't even consider it dialogue. You have long periods where there is some action in the movie, but long periods in which the characters are simply showing their surprised faces and looking at each other side to side. I wouldn't even call that dialogue. So I agree with this, but I don't agree why they're putting 5 stars when they just basically told me that this movie was crap. So that's the weird thing about Rotten Tomatoes, and that's why I enjoy going through these, because I won't even notice there's 5 stars there when I start reading a bad review, and then I'm like, wait a second, that wasn't a 5-star review. So let's continue. 4.5 stars. Not so many understood this film. I loved it and would see it again in theaters. It was just ahead of its time. No, this comes across as an attempt to turn an episode of Star Trek into a 2001 Space Odyssey mimic. 2001 Space Odyssey actually, I think, had more influence on this than George Lucas's Star Wars. Certainly, you had long special effects sequences that didn't really serve any purpose other to show that they had like an incredibly talented crew of animators on board the production team. And it shows they really did have talented people there. But why this didn't move the plot forward? It just felt like plot filler. All these long drawn out special effects sequences in which the Enterprise is traveling inside the anomaly cloud of V'Ger. It was just time wasted footage, pretty much. 2.5 stars. I always liked the idea of Star Trek better than its realization. This was a slow mover out of the gate that never really gained momentum. We're halfway through the movie before anything really happens. Even the uniforms were a disappointment. The original TV series had much classier uniforms than these banal wardrobe. Yeah, the uniforms are like something out of a 1970s pajama party. It really is that bad. It's also kind of telling that the color's been taken out of it. Something that really attracted me as a kid to Star Trek when I first saw it on TV and syndication was the colorful uniforms. As a kid, it was almost cartoonish, the color that popped out between the different crew members, and that's what drew a 9-year-old or even a 6-year-old's gaze to the screen to get into it. It was the color, the way the colors popped. And here you had like a pastel slumber party, and it was completely weird. It was out of sorts for what we knew from the original show, and it fit with the tone not matching. The whole tone of Star Trek the Motion Picture does not belong in Star Trek. It's tonally more like 2001 A Space Odyssey. It's very like what they say, what people call this on the internet often is Star Trek the Slow Motion Picture. Or Star Trek the Motionless Picture, and those are both very apt descriptions. We have a 3.5-star review. What happens when you try to make a feature film out of a TV pilot for a show that had been off the air for 10 years, throw in some cool Douglas Trumbull special effects, and a bombastic score by Jerry Goldsmith, a mediocre movie at best? I am a lifelong Trekkie, and I actually like this movie to a point. The effects are pretty darn good and captivating for 1979 and are really accentuated by the score. The ships look huge and the scenes in Space Dock are essentially a love letter to Trek fans. Yes, the wasted filler, the beauty shots, they are a love letter, fan service to Star Trek fans, but they don't move the plot forward, and it doesn't work for somebody that's not a fan of the original. I mean, this did work in 79, like I said. I found this okay as a 9-year-old sitting there watching this on the screen for the first time. But this is not acceptable to somebody today that's not a fan of the original show and doesn't know much about it. It just comes off as complete boring crap. So I understand completely. I also understand that Jerry Goldsmith did the score. You can see that right away. There's no problem with the score. It's fantastic. Again, it uses this score like it uses a lot of the beauty shots of the outside of the ships to impress you with the fact that they have a budget for an awesome score, that they've got the budget that Lucas had for Star Wars, but it doesn't move the plot forward. In fact, it just accentuates how exciting they're trying to make a lot of wasted beauty shot footage. 2 stars. It's Star Trek at its worst. No, I wouldn't say it's at its worst. I would say it's Star Trek at its most boring. Star Trek at its worst would be perhaps Star Trek Nemesis. That's worst, but it's not boring worst. It's just worst. Now, I always say boring is the worst crime you can commit. It's not the same thing as just being bad or rubbing people the wrong way. Boring is something that will keep you from finishing something. It's the antithesis of what a writer would want. Worst is actually beneficial in a lot of ways. With the right marketing, worst can actually work. 2.5 stars. Good idea, interesting characters, but awful pacing. Again, very, very slow. Nothing seems to happen. 5 stars. Considering it was such a long wait for Trekkies to finally have a movie, I think all the criticism of this movie is ridiculous. It was a great concept brought to us in a huge way on the big screen, although Spock's giant self was a bit odd. The rest of the movie plays out well. The movie's end pushed the boundaries of your imagination and gave it closure. I, for one, think it's a very good Star Trek movie. Funny thing is, I do agree that even the even-numbered movies are better. There's that old saying, ignore the odd-numbered movies in the Star Trek original film franchise. It's mostly correct, but it's just coincidence. No curse to be found there, I believe. Again, they're referring to, they're excusing some of the slowness of the movie because it was made as fan service to the original fans. Yes, you can excuse about 10 minutes of the footage, but what about the other 2 hours? See, that doesn't hold up. 4 stars, 81 out of 100. I was pleasantly surprised by Star Trek the Motion Picture. The movie really plays like an ambiguous Spielberg or Kubrick movie about human consciousness, almost like Close Encounters of the Third Kind or 2001: A Space Odyssey. The middle of the movie can feel like it drags, though. That's because the movie's biggest strength, it's also its biggest weakness. The cloud that the Enterprise crew are approaching is faceless, without interest to the audience. Again, you don't have a real villain. Even if the premise were exciting and new, and even if the end of it was an awesome plot twist that you didn't see coming, which it wasn't, you have no clearly defined villain. Your action-adventure fails because there's no action, there is slight adventure, but there's no villain, there's no antagonist. The only antagonist you could count in the movie is Captain Kirk himself, because Captain Kirk comes off in the movie as a real dickhead. He comes on board the Enterprise as an admiral, then just makes himself a captain, takes everything over, and tells the guy that's the real captain of the Enterprise to just take a back seat and sit down and shut up. And it's very off-putting from, Kirk's character, the original series, and Kirk does nothing but screw things up. Throughout the first half of the movie, his bad decision making, and other crew members fix these bad decisions, including the captain that he told to sit down and shut up. So it's really strange. On one hand, they're trying to recreate the nostalgia of the original series for fans and do fan service, but on the other hand, they're showing you that this Admiral Kirk is actually a screw up. He's incapable of making proper decisions, so it's weird. 2.5 stars. Awesome special effects barely save this movie from its dull and dialogue-heavy pace. Right. There's a lot of explanation through dialogue. There's a lot of dialogue between two secondary characters. Again, it doesn't have a real villain. The secondary character of V'ger's, the woman that becomes V'ger's host body, so to speak, she's not really a villain. She's something to bounce dialogue off of in a slightly antagonistic way, but she's no villain at all. It's not portrayed that she is. The big plot twist in this is that this is not a villain of any regard that we're dealing with. When the mystery is solved at the end, it just doesn't move. 3.5 stars. Star Trek the Motion Picture was great to look at. It had some humorous parts in it and dry wit. When it all comes at the end, you're going to be twisted of what is this new dilemma they are faced with. You're going to love it or hate it. Many people don't like it, but I found it to be fascinating, disturbing, and it places us on a whole other level with the terms of science fiction can handle. I think this was like a long episode, but they didn't have the excitement of, say, Star Wars. I don't even know where this reviewer is coming from because it's like they're talking about another movie. It wasn't very humorous. There wasn't hardly any dry wit. There was not any fascinating or disturbing material in this. No, I disagree. 5 stars again. Star Trek has never been as epic as this film is. You know, it's funny, I'm seeing a whole page of 5-star reviews here, and yet we still have a rotten audience score and a rotten critic score. So I'm going to continue until I find something that actually tells me more about why this is rotten, other than my opinion. 3.5 stars. It's good. The story isn't told that well, and I'm not exactly a Star Trek expert. Don't know entirely what's going on, but I can get a basic idea of it. Star Trek the Motion Picture is also really good visually, so even if I can't entirely tell what's going on, at least I see the great visuals the movie has. Well, that's telling me something. Somebody's admitting they don't exactly know what's going on, but it has great visuals. That's almost like, you know, my 9-year-old self sitting in the drive-in. I knew what Star Trek is. Like I said, I was a walking encyclopedia of the original Star Trek series at 9 years old. A lot of people my age were. Some are now to this day. But I didn't exactly know what was going on either with this film, so that's telling. 5 stars. I went to see this at the cinema in 1979. I was totally blown away with it. Great science fiction, super story, brilliant special effects. I've watched it at least once a year ever since VHS videos, then DVD came out. Coming up to 40 years old, and this gem of a film still stands the test of time. Even the effects still seem good. It's not for everyone. There is very little We Come in Peace, Shoot to Kill or Klingons on the Starboard Bow, but this film was an excellent link between the original. No, I completely disagree. This is somebody that said they saw this in '79. I have the feeling they were a lot older than me because that's not the way I took this film. 5 stars. It's been a bit of a Star Trek year for me all told, and whilst it has been centered around recent series, I have been reviewing both the theatrical and extended cut of the motion picture recently. I am surprised this film hits so low with the audience even now, as it is a work of real imagination. Even in a post-Star Wars world, a good example of this is the beauty of the Matt Jeffries designed the original series ship, and a comment I overheard regarding the motion picture from 1979 recently. The ship is beautiful, but he probably overheard the comment saying the ship is beautiful, the soundtrack is fantastic, but it's boring. I almost fell asleep, or I did fall asleep. I see where this is going. Again, that's not worthy of 5 stars. Another 5 star. The best movie character ever portrayed, William Shatner as Captain James T. Kirk, with the best movie score ever composed. I disagree. 2 stars. The only time I've ever fallen asleep during a movie in the theaters. The first 30 to 40 minutes are fun, but the rest of the movie is just a very slow slog. It's a slow slog before even 20 minutes go by, so I disagree. I agree with the 2 stars, though. 3.5 stars. It's a Star Trek movie, as it's the first one since the end of the TV series. It's a slow burning story that is very sci-fi at its core. It's not burning. There's slow all right, but I wouldn't call it a slow burn. a slow burn and actually leads up to something. You might have had an actual villain. You get reveals on what kind of villain you're facing. We don't get that. It's a slow pace and a slow motion picture, but no slow burn. Get the burn out of here entirely. 1 star. First 15 minutes or less, good. Rest is some of the worst movie moments ever in history. Now, I can kind of get on board with that review. 5 stars. It's a beautiful and fascinating film. Beautiful, yes. Fascinating, no. 4 stars, totally weird vibes, love it. Yes, it is totally weird vibes. If you started with, say, any of the Generations movies, or you started with the original show, or you started with The Wrath of Khan and then went back and saw this for the first time, this is weird. I'll give it that. 5 stars. My favorite Star Trek film, seriously. I found it fascinating when I first watched it and enjoyed the reuniting of the crew, and it was also the first Star Trek film I've seen. Yeah, it's slow. Have ye no patience? Remember the first time and you didn't know what the mystery reveal was? The mystery reveal was like a big letdown. At 9 years old, I hadn't caught on to what it was, but no, it's not any kind of plot twist. It falls flat. When you say, have ye no patience, well, I also recall seeing 2001 A Space Odyssey at around the same age. And even at that time, 9 years old, this reminded me of that. Again, I was very bored. I saw a showing of 2001 A Space Odyssey in the theater. My parents took me to see it. I'm glad they did. It was something of a historical movie. It gave me context on a lot of other stuff. I appreciate what Kubrick was trying to do, even more so now that I'm older. But as a kid, I found it the most boring movie of all history. The only thing exciting was when the astronaut Dave Bowman got locked out of his spaceship by Hal. That was like a very small part of the movie, the running time. I found that interesting, and then the rest put me to sleep. I could barely sit through the last 20 minutes of it. The last 20 minutes of 2001 Space Odyssey reminded me of long stretches of this film. There's no question that's not a coincidence. That was definitely intended by Paramount. It was a mistake. Half a star. Do you have trouble sleeping? Well, here's the cure. I like Star Trek. I was raised on TNG and Voyager, and Star Trek First Contact is still one of my top favorite movies of all time. I'll agree on that. I say it's my favorite. I'd say First Contact and Wrath of Khan are neck and neck for my favorite. They're different time periods, and they're different, series in the franchise. Each one are the best of each franchise, I would say, or each generation. I agree with that. But my God, this movie is hard work. I imagine watching a piece of wood bobbing on a steel leg for 2 hours while lobbing a stone at it every half hour on the dot. That is this movie. I agree largely. It would be a beautiful lake, beautiful trees, beautiful atmosphere, and the wood would be finely, intricately detailed, and you zoom around the piece of wood and you see all the little divots and niches in the grain of the wood and the waves that hit the wood once in a while. And yeah, that would be like this. Beautifully shot and beautiful score to go with it. 3 stars. I never understood why many praised the visual design of this film back in the day, as we had films like Star Wars and Alien, which were ages beyond Star Trek the Motion Picture. That is the core problem of the film, as the entire crew spends a majority of screen time going oh and ah over special effects sites or flying by the Enterprise for 4 or 5 minutes. No, it's not 4 or 5 minutes. You get good 10-minute stretches there. I love Star Trek. I own every series and every film on DVD except Star Trek Discovery, and it will stay that way. Despite the drab set design and the effects, I largely agree with this. I wouldn't give it 3 stars unless you just want to give it that for how much money it spent in 1978 and 79 during production. You could give it a good 3 stars for that spending effort, but it amounts to 2 stars. 5 stars, exceptional, beautiful film for true old Star Trek Trekkies. Still William Shatner and Leonard Nimoy at their best? No, completely disagree. Spock, his character shows up in this. He's a stranger. Now, the movie gives you the impression that only a year or so has passed between the original series events and this movie, but it comes across as Spock has been gone for a decade or more, and he's almost a stranger to them now. It's very off-putting. It doesn't fit. And I would say definitely William Shatner's portrayal of Kirk, it doesn't fit with the original series. He's very boring, and the dialogue he does have, the actions he takes, just make him to be more of an antagonist and a bad decision maker than the original series. It's not good at all. In fact, I completely disagree with this review. 2.5 stars. Worship at the house of the alien entity V'ger. Yeah, I kind of agree with that. That's a very simple review, says it all. 3.5 stars. It's not the best, but it could have been worse. Yeah, it could have been worse. It could have had a low budget on top of it. There's that. 3.5 stars. Sure, it may not quite qualify as a good standard film, but this is what I thought after watching all of the original 1966 shows and about half of Next Generation. Quite an observable and visually stunning film, the franchise's first mark in the full-length film industry. The classic crew get together in the USS Enterprise for the first time and set off to one adventure that they will likely not forget, especially since it was a threat to Earth. It seems almost like an over 2-hour episode, but yeah, exactly. This was meant to be an episode of a series that never happened. It is a copy and paste of an actual original series episode, but it's more boring, and it's like they spent a lot of money to produce visuals just to make filler to stretch this out. That's the impression I get. 3.5 stars. Let's address the limping elephant in the room right off the bat. This movie is very slow to start out, and Jim Kirk is kind of a, but the visuals and fantastic score by Jerry Goldsmith more than make up for it. In fact, it was so well received that it eventually became synonymous with The Next Generation 8 years later. Maybe if you say that this movie could kind of match or be a synonym for like Star Trek Generations, because Star Trek Generations was certainly boring, but even Generations had a lot more action, so I disagree. It is cringe-worthy to watch Star Trek The Next Generation from the beginning in 2019. I tried it. It comes across as very cringeworthy because your best memories of it are from season 4 and beyond. And then when you go back to season 1 and you see how it doesn't quite work and they're still trying to find their footing, so to speak, it's kind of cringeworthy, especially the opening pilot episode 2-parter of Star Trek The Next Generation. But otherwise, this doesn't, this motion picture, it doesn't come across as cringy at all, even in 2019 to me. It just comes across as boring. And you can't really compare that to other Star Trek films because even the worst of them, they're not just outright boring like this. 5 stars. The first time I saw this, it was on VHS. I thought it was slow and confusing. Then I saw it remastered on Blu-ray and I was like, oh my god, this is so awesome. Beautiful, just effing gorgeous. To say this movie is boring is like saying the Mona Lisa is boring. This is 2001: A Space Odyssey of Star Trek. I appreciate the 2001 reference and I agree with it, but don't compare this to the Mona Lisa because the Mona Lisa is not marketed and promoted as an action adventure. Okay, the Mona Lisa is appreciated for what it's marketed. And it is marketed, let's be honest. Art is marketed. The Mona Lisa is marketed as what it is, what you get when you appreciate it. It's art. It's a painting. This is not marketed as a painting. It uses paintings in the backgrounds. It does as part of the visual effects. But this was not marketed as a painting. And to this day, it is still not marketed as a painting or a movie of a painting. So I disagree completely on that. 3 stars. A decent start for the cinematic beginnings of Star Trek. But thankfully, they gave it a second go with The Wrath of Khan. I completely agree there. This movie could have killed any future Star Trek movies. It was so bad. The Wrath of Khan saved it all. If it wasn't for The Wrath of Khan, there would be no Star Trek The Next Generation. There wouldn't have been other films. Yeah, The Wrath of Khan saved Star Trek. Star Trek the motion picture suffers from an overuse of ethereal themes, poor pacing, and simply too long of a running time. Exactly. You could have gotten this to a 3-star movie, in my opinion, by just cutting the running time down. That's it. because you had enough for, like, say, a 90-minute movie. That's it. But they went to 2 hours plus. That's what really did this in. 4.5 stars. My favorite Star Trek movie. Good story, good acting, and more mood than you would expect. Not an action film, but a thinking person's film. Well, Star Trek, the original series, wasn't. It was a thinking person's film in regards like the Twilight Zone original episode was the thinking person's sci-fi, weird type of thing. I'm not bagging on the Twilight Zone. I'm just saying that, yes, to an extent, it's a thinking person's thing, but it's not like a Mona Lisa, sit down on the bench and stare at the Mona Lisa for 4 hours and ponder what it means to your life type of thing. It's not all that. So please, let's stop with the thinking person's analogy. We don't go watch Star Trek movies or the original series or any of it to get just a philosophical message. We have movies for that. They win Academy Awards for that. This isn't one of those type of things. 1.5 stars. Thank God for Wrath of Khan, or Star Trek would have died if they tried this crap again. I agree 100%. If it hadn't been for Star Trek: The Wrath of Khan, if that movie had bombed for whatever reason, if Star Trek: The Wrath of Khan had bombed, it would have wiped out all the rest of the Star Trek stuff we know from today. Period. That's a fact. 3 stars. As more of a Next Generation fan, I wanted to give these a watch just for fun. The characters are entertaining enough, even though there isn't much going on. Yeah, you're being very kind. There isn't much going on. 4 stars. Weird, lovely, and wonderful. 2.5 stars. Gene Roddenberry's direction has a sense of wonder and visual beauty, but its pacing and plot is dreary, boring, and too long. I don't know about Gene Roddenberry actually being the overriding director in this. I question that. 2 stars. Long, slow, dull, and full of special effects that aged poorly. A must-see for the fan, but a poor introduction to the franchise for just about everyone else. And I want to touch on something else. The original Star Trek, the original series, that has more of a Western TV show feel to it. That's because Gene Roddenberry wanted this to be a Western in space. It ran during a time period in TV history where the airwaves were just flooded with Westerns. And I consider that the dark time for me, because as a kid, when I turned on the TV at any time of day after school, I would just be flooded with Western shows. How many times can you watch Gunsmoke or Bonanza? It was really, or Little House on the Prairie. I was flooded by those type of shows as a kid, and I was tired of it. And Star Trek being in syndication and always being there every day for people of my age got us through like a dark time where we had very little sci-fi. And so Gene Roddenberry went into this Star Trek show, the original series, trying to pull Western TV show fans into a sci-fi show. So that's why he called it like the wagon train to the stars. It worked fantastically, at least it did on people my age. So here we have somebody saying that, it's a thinking man's type of thing and that he's glad Gene Roddenberry was there to give us this Star Trek the Motion Picture. I completely disagree, and that's why I don't think Roddenberry's vision of this is portrayed at all. I think Star Trek The Wrath of Khan is a more accurate Gene Roddenberry film. So I completely disagree that, Gene Roddenberry wanted this to be long, slow, and boring like 2001: A Space Odyssey. I don't think that was his intent at all. 2 stars. Long, slow, dull, and full of special effects that aged poorly. A must-see for the fan, but a poor introduction to the franchise for just about everyone else. Yes, I agree 100%. If this is your first exposure to Star Trek, then I'm sorry and I apologize, and try to do a do-over and watch The Wrath of Khan, because yeah, this isn't making any fans, not in the modern day, certainly not with the millennial generation. They're not going to put up with this slow thing called Star Trek the Motion Picture. And that would probably be why we have our rotten reviews. 2.5 stars. A misguided plot dipped into a space fest. Star Trek the Motion Picture, the makers, takes too much time to sink their teeth in their characters and the surrounding offered to them, leaving them spending way their first act, which is clearly not feasible, as they suffer for it later. I'm not going to read through this English, but yes, they're saying that, wow, this thing is just seeming to go nowhere. And a lot of people are telling me in these reviews that they had the same reaction I did as a 9-year-old. For some reason, it's kind of confusing. It doesn't seem confusing to me as an adult, you know, the way the plot in this movie moves. But as a kid, I kind of found it like I got lost in it. And people are, you know, they're saying that in these reviews too. Um, you know, so that part I don't understand why. I just remember seeing it for the first time that I got kind of lost as to what was going on as well. But as an adult, I don't get that vibe from it. I just think it's boring. 2.5 stars. Cool visuals, but a boring story. 3.5 stars. Good for its time. Lots of dramatic building scenes that drag on. Yeah, I don't even think they're dramatic. They're actually kind of boring too. The character interactions are very minor in this, and they're boring. 3.5 stars. I thought the movie was not as good as the TV show, but it was good. The actors were good. The soundtrack was really good. The story was good, although it was a prequel. The story was far from the series. Yeah, you're giving this too much. I don't agree. You're giving this way too much credit. 5 stars. For better or for worse, this is what Star Trek 1966 to 69 would have been if they had a bottomless budget. Yeah, I'll agree with that. Star Trek, the original series, is like a lot of TV shows that became cult classics. The reason they became cult classics is because they didn't have unlimited budgets. The directors, the producers were very constrained in what they could do, and that made the writing tight. That made people go over things, so to speak, with a fine-tooth comb. They couldn't just ramble on with an endless budget and try to make up for it with effects. We see that a lot. Anytime you have something with a huge budget thrown at it, it's almost less likely to develop a following. Star Trek was on a very tight budget, and if you watch the original show, you'll see that in the production, and I think that's what made it what it was. 5 stars. For better or worse, this is what Star Trek would have been if they had a bottomless budget. I'm reading that again for a reason. It's intensely cerebral with a pretty good premise, but very slow going. They really milk those special effects. For me, this has everything I would have wanted from a Star Trek movie, but it's not for everyone. It's more in line with 2001: A Space Odyssey, and to a lesser extent, The Abyss. I wouldn't drag The Abyss into this. Speculative science films about exploration. Hard science fiction that puts science ahead of laser blast action. No, there's no real hard science in this either. Yes, Star Trek later became known, especially in like Voyager, for example. You know, it got really convoluted and detailed in this building, the world building with the technology. This is not like this in Star Trek the Motion Picture. The sci-fi is a backdrop. Basically, it's not really highly technical. 2 stars. Neat story, boring as hell, slow as hell. Production was hell from all reports. Would have been off as a 2-part TV show. Yeah, it should have been a 1-part pilot episode, and that's what it was originally intended for. I also agree, production was hell. I've heard stories that, yes, they barely got this out to the market in time. That's why some of the CGI effects, if you look at them a second time, you can see the flaws. And there are some blatant flaws that your eye will catch on the second viewing. 3.5 stars. Beautiful and extremely underappreciated for a reason. 4 stars. I don't particularly think it's fair to rate this Star Trek film against all the others. The tone and focus of the film is very different to every film that would follow. It bears more resemblance to the 1960s TV serial in that it is very concept-based. In fact, I think as an episode of the 60s series, this story would work well, and perhaps that's its only problem for me, that the story is stretched paper thin over the film's runtime, yes, to the point that the approach to the Enterprise of the shuttle takes however many minutes. Yeah, it takes like what, almost 10 minutes, like 8 minutes, just to like get the shuttle into the Enterprise. Real bad. They're talking about how the tone is off. Yes, the tone is off. The tone of this is like 2001: A Space Odyssey. The tone of the original series is like a TV show, a Western that you would find on the TV show from the 1960s. And the tone from the other movies is an action adventure, straight up action adventure. So you've got 3 different tones going out there. There were some episodes of the original series that had this type of tone. Very few in the 3rd season that was canceled. like Spock's brain, for example, and that's why those are like the least favorite of anybody, especially of fans of the original. The tone is way off in this movie, real bad tone. 4 stars. Personally, this is the movie I enjoyed the most in the series. The first and original attempt at the big screen. It largely succeeded for me, capturing the magic and adventure of the TV show and managing to convey the epic nature of the voyage in search of VGA, or V'ger. Yeah, I'll say it's epic in its effects for the time. It's epically overdone. It's epically time-wasting. Continuing, the twist revealing who V'ger was and the reason for its mission was wonderful, in my opinion, as was the fusion of the two beings at the end. There were also some great special effects for the time, depicting the machine planet's protective universe. You know, I'll disagree on that ending. In the ending, it was kind of anticlimactic. It was more of an explanation of what the mystery was. And for one of the main characters, or two of the main characters actually, to fuse together and beam off into the artificial intelligence world, it didn't make a lot of sense. The characters weren't fleshed out. Their motivations weren't known well enough for this to be dramatic, like they portrayed it as being dramatic. It wasn't. You had the character rushing out to do this heroic thing, volunteering at the end to sacrifice himself to do this thing, and it felt completely meaningless because we didn't know enough or sympathize enough with this character. It was like a cardboard character doing this. It was really disappointing. 5 stars. It has its flaws, but is an awesome vision. It's an awesome vision of the special effects creators, yes. 2.5 stars. Modern audiences will get some quality shut-eye during this flick, although they may miss a few interesting scenes along the way. I will agree 100% with that. 3 stars. This movie worked for me as the first time Star Trek is taken to the big screen. It will always be the first TV series to be adopted as a major motion picture. While it is a slower-paced movie, the subtle, mystical, and pseudo-religious theme and nature of this movie makes it work. Despite of production troubles, a great score lifts this movie. Well, no, don't even say it's got some kind of pseudo-religious theme. If you look at the special effects, like the long, drawn-out special effects where the Enterprise is entering V'ger, it's more of a pseudo-sexual theme. And so is the character that becomes like the puppet or avatar of the V'ger entity. That's a sexual thing. The whole thing turns into a pseudo-sexual thing. If you don't believe me, watch it again and look at the actual effects and what they are, and look at why you have more attention drawn to the sexuality of V'ger's avatar than you do on actual plot or character development otherwise. No. Religious, no. Sexual, yes. 2 stars. A 2-hour pilot episode is what it feels like and is what it was. Never really intended to be a movie. I kind of agree. 5 stars. This film has aged with the decades. Intelligent storyline, sci-fi classic. Yeah, it's aged itself into irrelevancy. It's aged its Rotten Tomato score lower by the each day that goes by. I wouldn't be surprised if the audience score goes down to 5% on this in another 10 years, assuming we're here on this site to look at it in 10 years. 4.5 stars. Most people consider this movie to be slow-paced and boring, but they don't notice the amazing visual effects, especially for the time, and top-notch soundtrack. Despite the low ratings it has, I still like it. And Gene Roddenberry, the creator of Star Trek, was at the helm. I don't know if he really was at the helm. Even if I see an interview where he's at the helm, I don't know if I believe it, if that's really true, who was really behind this thing. I could see that the special effects creators were really in charge here, and maybe Gene Roddenberry kind of let them take over, because this was not the tone at all from what we got in Star Trek. 5 stars. Now this is Star Trek, not that 2009 reboot piece of what. This really looks like a motion picture. Special effects were good and the story is interesting. It's such a wonderful start to the original 10 films. I don't know who reviewed this. I would watch the 2009 J.J. Abrams Star Trek soft reboot, alternate whatever, again another 5 times before I watched this movie. And in fact, I'm a fan of the original in every regard, and I liked the 2009 movie, and I've seen it at least 5 times already. If I had a choice between that and this, 2009 would win hands down every time. 3.5 stars. I like this, love the music, love the 70s vibe. LOL. The real problem is that the film was an episode that was stretched out really big. I'll largely agree. But no, I thought the 70s vibe was actually off putting. I mean, you see the character of McCoy beamed or brought aboard the Enterprise, and he's literally wearing a 1970s disco outfit. Not kidding. It was like they pulled him out of the disco era of Star Trek, and you're wondering while you're watching this, did the Earth culture undergo like a phase where it went through the 70s disco again? I mean, that could be after 2 more centuries. It may go through the 70s disco craze again, right? But it was just a really weird vibe to see that in Star Trek. Even in 79, it was weird to me as a 9-year-old to see Disco McCoy. 3.5 stars. A misunderstood and unappreciated piece of authentic science fiction. The first feature film from this franchise has an interesting and thought-provoking story while showing off impressive special effects. You're giving it too much credit. 3.5 stars. It's pretty easy to see why Star Trek the Motion Picture is one of the more divisive movies in the franchise. I mean, it has those familiar and beloved characters, it has a story that feels very reminiscent of the classic series, so what's not to love? Well, it has a pace roughly equivalent to the speed of a 200-year-old tortoise. It takes almost 15 minutes of dialogue-free shots just for Kirk to board the Enterprise in this film, and that's just the tip of the slow-moving iceberg. Yeah, exactly. I'll agree with this. I don't understand why you're saying all this and you're giving it a 3.5 star. Again, Rotten Tomatoes fans, you have to love them. 1 star. The effects hold up, but the dialogue is cheese and is so boring. But it makes Wrath of Khan look even better than it is, so there's that. Yeah, watch these together. Wrath of Khan looks like an Academy Award winner in almost every way. 5 stars. I think this is a great film debut of our favorite characters. Feels a whole lot like you're watching a very artistic and visually stunning episode of the original series. The dialogue and sweeping visuals are a real treat, and Jerry Goldsmith's soundtrack is beautiful and timeless. I'll agree in that if you took an original episode that wasn't that great, and then you put this kind of budget into it, and you just let the special effects people take over and show what they could do in 79, then this is a stunning, crowning achievement by all means. This should have gotten Academy Awards for that effort. If that were the intent, then wow, I'd give this thing 3 gold medals. Otherwise, no. 3 stars. It's hard for me to give a Star Trek movie anything lower than 3 stars because I enjoy all of them. Because even the bad ones have some good and some really good, even if the story fails it. In this case, the good is in the Jerry Goldsmith score and the beautiful Enterprise. The really good in the wonderful chemistry between Shatner, Nimoy, and Kelly. I'll disagree on that one. No, it didn't feel right. But it fails because while it is gorgeous to look at, it's really slow and boring. They stretched a 44-minute episode story into a 2-hour and 12-minute movie. Yes, exactly. And they stretched it out with the visual effects. It's like the director, whoever was really directing, said, oh, wow, this is a great 44-minute episode. Hey, effects guys, what can you do to make this 2 hours and 12 minutes? And they said, well, with a few $1,000,000, we can make it 3 hours. And it probably was 3 hours, and they cut it down to 2 hours and 12 minutes. That's the way it feels. 1 star. This movie is so boring. It is boring and forgettable. They could have edited out a lot of this movie. I agree. It should have been down to like 89 minutes. 3.5 stars. After a 10-year gap, it was better to see the old crew again. This at least started the return in better movies. Yeah, you can give it that. This was a step in the right direction. But the problem is, when you talk about that 10-year gap, that's the 10-year gap in the real world for people living on Earth in the real world. But in the gap between the show and the original series and, these same characters in the movie, in the Star Trek universe, there wasn't a 10-year gap. And yet the interaction between the characters, it felt like there was. That's just bad. That was part of the bad tone at the beginning. 2.5 stars. Not a bad movie by any means, but not that great. It sometimes feels like it's trying to imitate 2001: A Space Odyssey instead of being a Star Trek film, and is a letdown for both the franchise and for filmmaking legend Robert Wise. I agree. It's a letdown because, yeah, you have the tone of 2001, but you have no epic artistic thing to say. When you got the mystery at the end, wow, it's really a disappointment. 2 stars. It's always painful to watch this movie. As a long-standing Star Trek fan, I'm obliged by law to watch all Star Trek material periodically. Yeah, it could be. I hate watching this one, and primarily because of the soundtrack. It is obnoxious beyond belief. How this score ever was approved just boggles the imagination. It is bombastic and just plain rude, but mostly it is irritating as all get out. And secondly, the sequences are often too long. All in all, this movie just plain sucks. I can't whitewash it. I agree with the sentiment. You know, when you mentioned that the music or the soundtrack is obnoxious, well, it's a fantastic score, but it doesn't fit with the original Star Trek at all. It doesn't really. If you watch the original, you know, the music that's, you know, iconically overdone now and made fun of the original series, the music that was used, the score, if you will, it doesn't fit with this at all. You know, I'm not saying this was bad. I'm just saying it doesn't fit in tone at all with the original series. 1 star, a movie that only cared about its special effects, not its story. That equals a bullcrap movie. I agree. I agree. 2.5 stars. If it were faster paced, the new side characters were better developed, and Kirk wasn't as incompetent, this would be a pretty solid beginning for the Star Trek films, given that it has a very interesting plot. I'll agree with everything except the interesting plot. There wasn't enough here for a movie. Otherwise, I agree completely. 2 stars. The worst part about this movie is that the characters never actually do anything to advance the plot. All their dialogue is reserved to petty squabbles and technobabble, and the film is too interested in its own special effects to even bother with letting them do much more than sit around and watch. Most of the movie is just shots of the Enterprise floating around in space and the crew looking on in awe, while we, the audience, would much rather be watching Star Wars. Yeah, I'll agree with that. A lot of it is just, you know, it almost looks like the characters themselves in this Enterprise are just there to, you know, to gaze in awe at the special effects. It's not even like they're gazing in awe of something they've never seen before in space, because actually, you know, in the Star Trek universe, these characters should have seen all of this kind of stuff before, but it's like they're gazing in awe of the special effects, and it's almost like I said, the special effects people were allowed to take over the control of this thing, and they wanted these characters to gaze in awe at their handiwork. That's the way this feels. 3 stars. While its visual effects are impressive for 1979, its uninteresting plot and hardly no tension whatsoever makes it feel like a 50-minute TV episode stretched to a 130-minute movie. And yes, exactly. Let's continue and hammer this point home. Please, let's do this. 3 stars. Its visual effects are impressive for 1979, but its uninteresting plot and hardly no tension whatsoever make it feel like a 50-minute TV episode stretched to a one. Okay, didn't I just read that one? But it hammered it in, didn't it? 2.5 stars. Beautiful aesthetic, but oh so boring. 2.5 stars. Saw this with the kids. It was boring. 1 star. Okay, Spanish, but I'll bet they're saying it's boring. 2.5 star or 3 stars. Star Trek: The Slow Motion Picture. It's basically a mix of the original series episode, The Immunity Syndrome, and 2001: A Space Odyssey. Interesting fan theory. We are witnessing the birth of the Borg, the merging of man and machine, the realization of perfection, and finding the higher purpose that V'Ger sought. You know, it would be cool if this were the birth of the Borg. It's not, because Star Trek canon says it's not. I thought that was something interesting that could have been done too. When I first saw the Borg in Star Trek: The Next Generation, I thought, I wonder if it like came from V'Ger, but no, they never made that part of canon. But I agree that would have been cool. 4 stars. A little slow, but man, was I happy to have Star Trek back when this came out. Gave it 4 stars because the series and franchise were gone for 10 years, maybe to never come back. A full-screen movie was a very bold leap reintroduction back then. Thank you. Okay, in that regard, I say yes, but that doesn't mean this is 4 stars. I still say 2 stars. 4.5 stars. I think the movie gets a bad rap because it's not as action-packed as most of the other Star Trek movies are. A lot of people find this movie boring, and I can understand where they're coming from, but personally I love Star Trek the Motion Picture, maybe even more than The Wrath of Khan. Yep, I said it. Maybe it's because before I saw it, I heard from a critic that liked the movie that he saw this as Star Trek's answer to Star Trek 1 or 2001: A Space Odyssey, and maybe I saw it the same way. Okay, so you're excusing it because you feel that this is like some kind of magnum opus to 2001. It's some kind of, Gene Roddenberry salute to 2001. No and no. Even if that were, it was a fail because it was even more boring than 2001. 2001, okay, it was boring to a 9-year-old, but as an adult, I can see it had a purpose. It wasn't just going nowhere to show you special effects. 2.5 stars. I think they were trying too hard and came up with kind of a mess. The first movie was not that good, but they make up for it in the next movie. Yeah, the next movie, it's like they're telling you to just forget about this one. They even changed the uniforms. They changed up everything. They changed up the character interactions. They literally wanted you to forget about this one. 2 stars, possibly the worst Star Trek movie. The first 30 minutes were okay, even though there was a long, unnecessary shot of the Enterprise. I like the idea of Voyager coming back to Earth, but everything happened slowly. When they encountered the probe, there was a lot of staring at the view screen and long shots of the Enterprise traveling to the heart of the probe. The special effects are pretty good for 79, but that's all this movie has going for it, and I couldn't recommend it. I agree 100%. 1 star, bad movie, cheesy even for 79, incomprehensible about the content in the movie. I don't think it was cheesy, it was just very disappointing and boring. Here we are going to go back. Tomato meter 42%, okay. Audience score 42%. I want to go lower, but like some of the reviewers said, as Star Trek fans, we just have a respect for the effort. So as a fanboy, I'll say, okay, 42%, I accept that. I think I've proven my point why it has these percentages, and I think they're completely justified. And I'm going to leave it at that, for better or worse. Remember, I'm a Star Trek fan, so it's not like I'm a hater. And I will see you again on the next episode of Rotten Reviews.